Well, good morning, everyone. So thankful for the opportunity to be with you again on this Thursday morning. We are live here on Facebook. I encourage you to have a Bible open or at least be following along and paying attention to things that we'll be studying today. This morning, we're going to be in John chapter 15. If you've been with us the last few weeks as we've been doing these Thursday morning studies, you'll know that we've been studying the I am statements of Jesus in the Gospel of John. And here we've come to the final one recorded in John's Gospel, and it's I am the true vine. And so we're going to be looking at that, when Jesus says that, why he says it, a little bit of the context, and making some application. But just as a little bit of housekeeping, since this is the last I am statement in John, we will be starting a new study next Thursday, and it's going to be similar. We're going to be in the I am statements of Jesus, but we're going to move over to the book of Revelation. And so that might seem a little intimidating perhaps for some, but if you look at the screen, you'll see that we're not spending a whole lot of time in the book as a whole. It's really the first two chapters and the last two chapters where Jesus makes these statements. And again, it's the same thing we've been going through in the Gospel of John, looking at these I am statements. We'll be going chapter by chapter. There's some where there's just one, there's some where there's two or three, and so we'll break those down chapter by chapter. But these discussion questions for each week will, for the most part, stay the same. We're looking for figuring out the context of why Jesus might be saying this I am statement, how this connects to the idea that he is I am, or Yahweh, the divine God, and obviously how it affects our relationship with him. So starting next Thursday, May 21st, we're going to be in Revelation 1. We encourage you, as always, to join us for those, or the videos will certainly be available on Facebook after the fact, as well as over on our YouTube channel if you'd like to watch them after the Thursday morning live stream. So before we begin, I'm going to lead us in a word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Gracious God, our Almighty Father, we approach your throne this morning, thankful for this beautiful new day. We are mindful of the birds singing outside, of warm weather that's rolling in. We look around us, Father, and acknowledge your power and your care and your concern for us, the work of your hand and the fact that you are mindful of each and every one of us. We thank you so much for this day that you have blessed us with, the many opportunities that lie in front of us. We ask that you would make us good stewards of all the things that you bless us with. And Father, now during this time, as we open our Bibles to understand you and your word, we ask that you would bless our efforts. Please be with us as we look to see what your Son says about him being this true vine, the fact that you are the vine dresser, and what it means for us as branches, that we can be abiding and focused in you. Help us to put these things to practice in our own lives. Help us to grow in these things and never settle, but that we would always be seeking to know you and serve you and love you better. We thank you for your Son and his sacrifice that makes this all possible, and it's in his name that we pray. Amen. So let's just dive right in. Zach, if you want to read for us John chapter 15, verses 1 through 11, we'll read this, and then Scott will kind of get us started with some context.
I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean, because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself, unless it abides in the vine. Neither can you, unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me, and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers. And the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be full. All right, Scott. Sorry I had to scroll down and couldn't get all of it. But
yeah. So the interesting thing about this, obviously, as we go forward, is the context in which it's said. So John, the 12th chapter, we're getting to the point where Jesus is obviously getting in the 13, the entering Jerusalem. You have the fact that he's washed their feet. They're in the upper room. And so chapter 14 ends in verse 31 by saying, "Get up, let us go from here." So you imagine they're leaving where they were, all these things that they heard in 14 about the one that's coming. They needed to be, kind of calm. He was preparing a place for them, all the different things we talked about last time, the helpers coming. So now you get into 15 and 16, and you almost, at least in my view, imagine them walking towards the garden, because he's going to, as you get into 17, begin to pray. And so you imagine them walking, and he's telling them this amazing points that he's making in 15 and 16. And so right off the bat, just understanding the context, he knows he's about to die. He knows what's about to come, but he's preparing his disciples, the apostles here, for what is about to happen. And so as we begin to think about this, Tyler, there's really 4 words that we want to focus on. Obviously, there's more that we can talk about, but there's 4 words that we really want to focus on. And at least the first one to me is the word abiding. One of the things that you'll find a lot with John in his writings is the term abiding. He'll talk about this a lot. The idea in First John, he'll write it, at least in the New American Standard, it's used 18 times in chapters 2, 3, and 4. So you see that here in chapter 15 of the Gospel of John as well. This idea of you've got to abide in me. So when you think about the vine, right, it makes sense that if we're in a branch, we have to abide or be a part of the vine. And so the understanding of that is obvious, hopefully. The difficulty sometimes is the application piece, which is obviously what we're going to be talking about here. So he gets on right off the bat, the idea of the Father, the Son, the different roles that we'll see and obviously talk about. And then he gets really into the mix of it, right? You're going to show it. You're going to have to show. It's not time to be saying it. It's about showing it. And as we go forward, I think verse 2, he says, "Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he prunes it so that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. Abide in me." And then you get into the abides that he's going to talk about. But it's amazing to think about the context that Jesus is going towards his death. He knows he is, but he wants to make sure that they understand that he's going to be with them, who he is, who the Father is, and quite frankly, in context, who the Holy Spirit is, and the roles that they all had from this. But Tyler, when you think about the verse 2 in particular, about talking about the pruning and the fruit, what comes to your mind?
So I think there's a couple things, really. I think when we read this verse, we can easily just kind of skip into it and really get into the abiding, because I think that is the big takeaway. But I think there's some principles being laid down in verse 2 that we need to pay attention to. Again, this idea of every branch, the idea that each and every child of God is this branch, that we're abiding in him and connected to him. And it's really focusing on this idea of fruit. And we'll talk about the fruit a little bit more in just a minute, what that looks like. But this idea that if we're not producing the fruit that we're called to produce, if we're not actually showing it, to what you just said, he's going to take it away. And again, you get the sense of roles. Jesus is there as the vine. He's providing the nutrients, the source of growth. He provides us everything we need. We have to be tapped into him. If we're not, that's when the vine dresser comes and takes it away. And it reminds me of the book of Acts, where it says that the Lord adds to the church those who are being saved. So it's not about the person who's doing the baptizing or the person who's preached the word or anybody. It's God who adds a soul to his church. And just like here, if we're not abiding in him, if we separate ourselves from that vine, he takes that branch away. And the thing that always catches me, though, about this is what he says in the positive regard, because you say, okay, I don't want to be that branch. I don't want to be separated from the vine. I want to be sure I'm producing fruit. And then he goes in the second half of verse 2, every branch that does bear fruit, he lets sit there and doesn't do anything to, and he says, good job. That isn't what he says at all. He says that every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes that it may bear more fruit. And so when you think about the idea of pruning any sort of plant, it's the idea of cutting. It's the sense of pain. You're cutting things back, and it's to stimulate more growth. So we can make some application here in different regards. Hebrews 12 will come to mind just from the idea of God's discipline, that it's painful rather than pleasant in the moment, but it ultimately yields the fruit of righteousness. That God disciplines us as a father disciplines children. It's for our benefit. But I think that's a limited view here of this verse. It certainly, discipline falls into this conversation, but it is not the sole definition of what pruning is here. We had a little bit of a conversation before this study of just what that pruning process might look like. And I think for right now, a lot of people, when we're going through stay-at-home orders and various things surrounding that, and the public health crisis that we're going through, we have this interesting idea of what it means to bear fruit for Jesus. So you can go to lots of places in the scriptures. I think Galatians 5 is just the easiest to go to see in verses 22 and 23, these things that if we have the Spirit abiding in us, if we're abiding in Jesus, this is going to be the evidence. This is going to be the proof. This is going to be the fruit that's being brought forth. So you talk about love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. That's going to be the evidence of that. But the idea here is, okay, so I'm being patient, and I've been patient for a month, and things still feel like they haven't changed. So I guess I'm done being patient. Well, perhaps you've grown in your patience during this time, but now the vine dresser doesn't say, okay, that's good enough. Now it's, let's prune. Let's show you where you can be even more patient. Let's give you more opportunities to practice that. You think you've got self-control. Okay, you've definitely made progress there. Now let's see how well you do self-control when it's somebody who's not being as kind or gentle in return. Let's see how the self-control can grow in that way. And so I think for a lot of us, we put limitations on what we think those fruits should look like. And this is one of the things that struck me just as we were reading this. There are people who are not abiding in the true vine who can be patient. There are people not abiding in Jesus who can have self-control. So we're not talking about the world's definition of love or joy or peace, because the world can kind of point to those things and people say, I have these things, and they might have a degree, but it's purely because God's allowing them to anyway. He's inviting us to true love, joy, peace, patience, and all those good things. So this is not by the world's definition, because I can certainly be patient, but then it's getting to a point and saying, okay, patience, that's, I've grown enough in patience. When in reality, if we're attached to the vine, we're constantly growing in patience. And so it's not the world's definition anymore of those things. It's actually the definition we find in the true vine. So are you as patient as Jesus? No, I'm not. Are you as self-controlled as Jesus? No way. I have lots of progress to make there. And I think we all do. And that's the point, that we never settle and say, okay, I've borne enough fruit. And that's that pruning process. That's God constantly showing us where we can grow and mature more and more as we move forward.
Well, I think that's the interesting part, even when you're talking about from a context standpoint, the idea that he's telling the disciples, you're going to have opportunity to see this very quickly, actually. There's going to be some things that you're going to go through. And what I want you to do is just abide, hold on, right? Yeah, I want you to understand what's about to happen. You're going to go through some obvious difficulties. You're going to go through things that you will never understand what's happening. Some things you'll get the picture when the Holy Spirit comes, but it's amazing for them to hear what he's saying. And this is specifically for them. That's an important piece of this. Obviously, we can learn from it. There's no question. There's principles for us to apply, which we are. But you imagine him just walking with them, talking about this, which is just so powerful. And it's just a tremendous example for all of us. And to your point, Tyler, there's the danger so often of comparing ourselves to the world when it comes to these things rather than to Jesus, and to the one that we are professing to be attached to or abiding in. And that's a tremendous point of this book. The other thing that's important to me in verse 2 that we see is that God knows who are his. He knows which ones are producing fruit, which ones are just saying that they are, which ones are not truly living it. He knows. You can fool a lot of people, right? But there's no way you're going to fool God. He knows those that are his. And that's certainly a theme that we've seen throughout a lot of the I ams. He knows his sheep. And so you have that perspective here as well, this idea of truly producing fruit. And it's not about, gaining approval or gaining from the standpoint of I finally have earned salvation type perspective, this is what a child of God does. This is what we do. If you are connected to the vine, the true vine, you're going to produce fruit because of him. You're going to glorify him. And that's going to be seen in our life, as we talk about in Galatians 5 and other passages as well. But it's sort of like the idea that you see in Romans, the 12th chapter. Why would you do any of those things as far as putting other people first and being a living sacrifice and the whole thing that's written there? Well, the whole purpose and why you do that is because of Jesus. And it's because of my relationship with him. And therefore, it's going to be seen in the things that I do, in my good works that I'm doing. And so there's an importance of understanding, first of all, the God part of things. He knows. And it's also important for us to understand we can fool ourselves into thinking we're part of this vine because we compare ourselves to other people. But this is about our relationship with God. This is our striving to be like Christ. That's what the whole Christian word is, Christ-like. We're striving to be like him. And that's the whole perspective as he's leading up to his death, that they needed to be understand, and we need to understand it as well. So when you do get into verse 4, and he says, abide in me and I in you, as a branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, so neither can you unless you abide in me. You know, Tyler and Zach, one of the things that I love about this is the relationship aspect that you do see here. It's the perspective of you are going to abide in me and I'm going to abide in you. There's this relationship that happens here. Obviously, when you're using the vines and the branches illustration, we can understand that. But even with God, even with Jesus and us, there's this relationship aspect that is highly important for us to understand, that we are going to abide in him. Now, when you think about abiding, it's not normally a word that perhaps we use very often. You may say remain, or there's some other words that might come to your mind with this. But the whole idea is, if I'm abiding in Jesus, it's not an issue for me to find time to have a relationship with him. There's not an issue of finding time to pray to him. There's not an issue to find time to think about him and meditate on him. And so there's certainly things that we need to understand. And I think obviously for majority of people, this time that we are in has given us the understanding that life in the fast lane doesn't have to be so fast, right? There's things that are not necessarily, but it's important for us to understand that we need to take the time to make sure that we are abiding in him and continuing to have that connection. And I'm afraid sometimes people think they have the connection and they actually don't. And that's the danger for all of us. You have to make sure that that connection is there.
Yeah. So even just going back to defining some of the terms, just with that, I can say I'm a branch, but am I actually a branch? You know, I've heard people from different persuasions or different teachings on this passage that'll basically suggest that the branches are different denominations that profess Jesus. And that's ultimately, when you read any sort of the context here, that's very quickly squashed, because to your point, this is about an individual relationship. This is an individual soul making the choice to abide in Jesus. And again, the other term that I want to go back and just emphasize, Jesus doesn't say, I'm the vine, you're the branches. He says, I'm the true vine. So it's kind of like what we talked about last week, where it's not just I'm a way, a truth, a life. I am the way, the truth, the life. And so Jesus is the source for everything we need. He, to his point, apart from me, you can say that you're attached to some other vine, but apart from me, you're going to be able to do nothing. And the concept there that we have all that we need through Jesus, we can certainly appreciate that there's life all around us, but that it all comes from God. And so he is the true vine, and he wants us to be tapped into that relationship. One of the questions, and I guess I'll just take this point, I see lots of people have joined since we started. I'm glad that everybody's here and watching and listening. If you are watching in real time, we encourage you to post questions, ask comments, any sort of thoughts that you might have here on Facebook as we're discussing this. We invite you to have the conversation with us. But one of the things we posted at the beginning was the idea of some of these questions we have. For me, looking at this idea of how does this idea of Jesus being the true vine point back to his divinity? And I think it comes back to this point that we're talking about with abiding. So for me, and I don't remember when it was, but I was reading Exodus in chapter 29, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks, where people will say the Old Testament God's mean and angry and the New Testament God's lovey-dovey. And the fact of the matter is, it's not either or, it's yes and lovey-dovey is obviously a little not appropriate, but it's the tenderness, it's the concern, it's the love that God does have. And so it's this kindness and severity, as Romans will talk about it, of God. But the goal that God has had ever since the beginning is to get us back into that relationship with him. In Exodus 29, you get to the part of Exodus where you get past the whole Prince of Egypt, yay, cartoon plagues, woohoo, they're out across the Red Sea, and then you get into all the rules. Here's how I want you to make the tabernacle. Here's the rules for the priests. It's still exciting when you understand the spiritual implication of those things, but sometimes we can get lost in the minutia of the measurements and the types of stones and the ceremonial things that are being established. But I think the whole point comes to a head at the end of Exodus 29, where God says, in verse 44, I will consecrate the tent of meeting and the altar. Aaron also and his sons I will consecrate to serve me as priests. I will dwell among the people of Israel and will be their God, and they shall know that I am the Lord their God who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God. So what's God's desire ever since man fell away? It's to get back and to be able to dwell. And you see that, again, we'll probably talk about it as we go through the I ams of Revelation, but at the end of Revelation, it's now dwelling in the midst of his people. There's this unity that's no longer the separation. And so Jesus offers that in this life now and into eternity, where we can abide with him, because God has always been striving for that. He wants us to abide with him, and he wants to abide with us. He wants to dwell with us. He wants to be close to you. And that includes you who thinks, well, he couldn't want to be close to me. Yes, he wants to be close to you because he made you and he loves you. And so we see that in the idea of Jesus being the true vine. He wants to supply us everything that we need for the spiritual well-being, for an eternity of bliss in our Father's presence. And so for me, that idea of abiding and dwelling just connects so clearly with this idea of the I am the true vine statement.
I think that's the interesting part when we talk about this abiding anyway, is the idea that you need to know him. You have to know him. And it's this, we can't not say this enough, it's this relationship that we have the opportunity to have with him that we need to be striving to work with. We understand this in any other facet of life. If you're going to have a good relationship on this earth with anybody, it's going to involve both parties, both sides doing something in order to engage that relationship. And the God part's already done, is going on, will continue to go on. It's never been an issue. That's not the issue of whether or not he's going to stop. The issue is whether or not we're going to stop, whether or not we're going to abide in him or choose not to. And it's a choice that you have. I mean, we certainly have seen that in the other I am statements as well. It's a choice that we have. But the reality is, it's not God that's the problem in this conversation. It's the us piece of it. Are we abiding in him? Do you really know him? And I think you kind of see that in our relationship aspect with him. I think we talked about this at least in one of the other classes that we do, is the idea that, reading God's word is a chore for a lot of people, unless you have a relationship with him and you understand that this book is going to save our souls and it's written by my Father. And I can read it, and he wants me to read it and to understand it. Prayer for a lot of people becomes almost like a wish. It's a wish list, rather than, if you have a true relationship with him, you have the opportunity to talk to your Father and to certainly ask of things and just to have a conversation with him. And it's an important lesson for us to learn as we grow in this abiding in him, that you need to know him. Zach, I think you were about to interrupt me.
Yeah. Forrest made a comment on the second question, which was, how does the statement give credibility to Jesus' claim to divinity? And he said, to answer question 2, we may look at this metaphor to the vine and God being the vine dresser as a new metaphor, but in fact it is a consistent message God gives us that we are his vine and he is our creator, caretaker. And he goes to Psalm 80. Even in this psalm, God references that he is the shepherd that protects, the shining light that saves, and the bread that sustains. And again, that his people are spiritual beings that he tends and makes flourish by pruning, edifying, etc.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Forrest. One of the things that's interesting, especially of the Old Testament, is that you'll see this illustration in particular used often. Certainly you see the sheep and the shepherd, but this is another one of those. Psalm 80 is absolutely one of those passages that you would go to with this conversation. So you imagine, as we've talked about, Jesus uses what would have been around them. They understood these things very, very well. For me, I can just imagine the fact that they're walking over to the garden and there's vines that they're seeing. You know, there's things that they're seeing all around them. But the idea for us is to, Forrest, point to the point that Tyler just made, is the idea that, you know, this is what God has always wanted. This has been the desire from the beginning. The question is, does man and our free will want it? And that's the individual piece of it. Are we striving to have that relationship? And as he goes on here, he makes it very, very clear. That's what I love about the gospel anyway, and love about Jesus. He makes it emphatically clear. You have a choice, right? You have this choice that you can make of how you would like to go. I'm the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing, is the verse that we just read. Verse 6, if anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away as a branch and dries up. And they gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. You know, dry branches are still useful for burning, right? That's the whole perspective of it, but that's not the purpose of a branch in and of itself. It's to bear fruit. And the idea is, as we read here, it's not about me, it's about him. You bear much fruit because why? You're a part of me. You're connected to me, as Jesus would say in verse 5. And that's the attitude that we need to have of understanding, to bring glory to him, of him being the true vine. And we're just doing that which we ought to do, as Luke will write in chapter 17. And that's the attitude, hopefully, that we have. This is the idea of people, wanting people to see our Father, wanting people to see God throughout all that we do. That's why Jesus in Matthew 5, 6 and 7, quite frankly, throughout the whole thing, talks about our relationships with other people. And the Sermon on the Mount is really seen, or our relationship with God, rather, is really seen in our relationship with other people. People are going to see him because we shine our lights. So we're going to glorify him. And that's what you certainly continue to see here in all the I ams. Jesus is I am. He is the eternal one. And this is the plan. And this is going to be the sustainer of life because we are connected to him. Or we can choose death. And that's obviously the choice that we have. Tyler, do you have anything to add to that part?
Well, I think it kind of leads into the next section anyway of our passage. This concept of abiding and the identity that we have in God. It does go back, and Jesus does here some tangible examples. Again, you mentioned they're getting ready to go over to the garden, and just the context of what's happening here, that he's saying hard things to them. He's going to keep saying hard things to them, kind of getting them ready for what's about to happen over in the garden. And this idea of, in verse 6 and 7, you mentioned the branch being thrown away, but in verse 7, he offers the positive of that. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. This concept of prayer and the trust in God and having faith in him to follow his will and asking according to his will, as we see John write over in 1 John towards the end of that letter. And I think you already brought up this point in verse 8. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples. Again, the proof is in the pudding. The fruit is going to show. You don't go to an apple tree and expect there to be pears on it. It's the idea that even back in Genesis 1, God made trees, and it's going to be a fruit for the kind of tree, and it's specific to that. So we are going to bear fruit based on what we have stored in our heart. And that concept is brought forth here. Jesus is inviting us to abide in his love, in his truth, the words that are called to abide in us. I love Psalm 119. I believe it's verse 10 or 11, and one of you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's the idea that the psalmist says, I've stored up your word in my heart so that I may not sin against you. It's not the idea that we're immune to sin, but that we are striving to practice righteousness and walk in this way by being connected to the true vine, that he's the one that's giving us that strength to withstand temptation, that he is giving us the focus to pursue the things of God. And you talk about all these different things that we can, but ultimately this point, my Father is glorified when you are being his children, when you are walking the walk, when you are not focused on everybody else, but when you are abiding in that vine, in his truth, then you're proving to be his children. And again, we've talked about some of the fruits that come from that. It's the love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control that we see in Galatians 5. 22 and 23. So it's an encouragement for them, I think, and it should be an encouragement for us that there's this great promise. If you abide in me, and there's that little tiny 2-letter word, if you're abiding in me, ask what you will, and that means that I have the relationship with God. If you are abiding in me, you understand that this is the father-child relationship, that it's not ask whatever you want and I'll just give it to you. No, he's going to be a good, loving father that guides us and directs us in his will.
It's interesting that he uses the term prove to be my disciple here. Mm-hmm. It's not about just going through the motions. It's not a checklist. I heard a quote one time, is the idea of walking into a church building makes you a Christian, like walking into McDonald's makes you a hamburger, right? Just because you walk into a building does not make you a follower, and so there's the understanding for us that it's about being abiding in him. It's about being attached to him. It's about remaining in him. It's about him dwelling in us, this relationship aspect that we have. It's not about a checklist. It's not about, okay, I've done this, and this, and I'm fine. It's this idea for us to understand that he absolutely wants a relationship with us. And the reason why I harp on this so much is that I'm so afraid people view this as a checklist, that it is an easy trap to fall into. It is absolutely an easy trap to fall into, that people, okay, I read my Bible today. Okay, I prayed, to just check them off. This is not about that. This is about you having a relationship with the Almighty, and the fact that he wants to have a relationship with you. But it's not about, you and I just saying that I have it, I'm his disciple. This is about, as Jesus says, you're proving it, you're living it, your fruit is showing that you are those things. When you become a disciple of God, a child of God, it absolutely changes you. It's not about you continuing to do the exact same things that you always, it's a change, it's a transformation that occurs in our relationship with him because of him. And it's our desire to serve him and to follow him is what makes us Christ-like. And the things that we've been talking about in the continual growth process, obviously, that takes place in that is that love part. And he goes on and talks about this, in verse 13 and 14, this idea of love, and love will continue to always come up when it comes to this topic, is it's going to be seen in your love for others. It's going to be seen in your love for me. Don't just say it, prove it. You're surrounded by people, surrounded by them that will say that they are children of God. That doesn't mean that they are. You are a child of mine if, as Tyler said, you're abiding in me, if you continue to do the things that you have been called to do. And really, Jesus is going to continue that whole point through up to his prayer that's in chapter 17. But it's just amazing to really truly understand, as he'll say, if you love me, then you keep my commandments. Prove it, live it. Don't just say it. Don't pretend, do it. And that's the hopefully the attitude that we all have of striving to serve him. As he says in verse 9, just as the Father has loved me, I have also loved you. Abide in my love. I mean, what else can you say? Jesus is walking to his death, telling them what they needed to do. And it's the same thing for us, us knowing the rest of the story. We know what happens. He loves us so much that he was willing to, first of all, his Father was willing to send him. He had the plan that was established. Jesus was willing to obey the plan, to follow through with the plan. And we need to abide in him because he loves us. And we have the opportunity to love him. It's awesome. That's absolutely awesome that we can even consider that opportunity that we have.
Well,
go ahead, Zach. I had a thought just to kind of say what you just said in a different way in case it might help somebody. Sometimes we think something and we believe it with our head, but it's not with our heart. So like that idea of I'm a Christian with my head, but it's not with my heart. And that's what we see in a lot of the world. They claim to be Christian with their words, but their actions don't prove, their fruit doesn't show that they are abiding in Jesus. And I just think that we can't just say it, we can't just think it, we can't get lost in our thoughts, but to actually our heart belongs to Jesus, and that we will bear the fruit.
Well, to that point, it comes down to this sometimes uncomfortable word that people think is only found in the Old Testament, but it's the idea of commandments. And Jesus says here in verse 10, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love. So you can ask all these questions. What's it mean to abide in Jesus? It means you're listening to him. What does it mean to abide in Jesus? It means I'm actually treating him like a precious father, as a brother, as Christ, as this master, as the Lord of my life, that I actually care what he says. And it's not just like, oh, I'm not doing what you're telling me. Are you kidding me? This is the person who died for you. You don't have no concept of the relationship if that's the attitude that we have of, well, God doesn't really care if I do. Listen, maybe you should talk to God about that before you start making assumptions and presuppositions about these things. That's why I think it's so important that when Jesus brings up this idea of commandments, this is one of the things I love about God too. He never calls us to do anything that he doesn't demonstrate for us of himself. So Jesus tells us, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments. What was one of his commandments, by the way? You're going to go and sacrifice yourself so that these people just have the chance to be my children again. What in the world, literally? And it's not of the world, it's of God. He says here, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and I abide in his love. So Jesus gives us that pattern. I'm following my Father's commandments. I'm listening to his voice. I'm hearing him. And so I'm doing the things that are pleasing to him. That's now the example for us. Jesus says, I'm the vine now. I'm showing you the Father. Now you are plugged in. If you are a branch in me, now you will show by following those commandments. You'll show that you are this great vine and not any other type of vine, because you're truly abiding in this one true vine that is Jesus Christ. And again, the promise here of verse 11 is just awesome. These things I've spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, that your joy may be full. I think about Hebrews 12 again, but this time at the very beginning of that chapter, where it's for the joy that was set before him, Jesus endured the cross. I mean, he's talking about joy right before he's arrested, he's betrayed, he's denied. All of his disciples, not just Judas and Peter, but they're all going to scatter and abandon him to some degree. And so he's telling them these things so that, again, they'll be reminded of this when the time comes, and that they can have this joy and the assurance that, okay, this is what it looks like to abide. This is what it looks like to desert. Now we have the choice. Abide in me, abide in my love. And Jesus is about to give the perfect example of what that love looks like and what obeying God's commandments looks like. It's self-sacrificial, ultimately yielding to the glory of God.
You know, it's interesting to even consider the fact that the apostles are watching this, they're listening, they've seen the Pharisees and how they act, and Jesus makes it emphatically clear, you cannot separate the Father and the Son. Now here he'll use it from the standpoint, as you said, the love side of things, but you even get into verse 23 of this chapter, he who hates me hates my Father also. This is the plan. This was the plan that was established. This is exactly what was going to happen. You cannot hate Jesus, Pharisees, and say that you love the Father. It's impossible. Were they saying that? Absolutely. Did they think that they were connected to the Jehovah? Absolutely they did. Were they? No. And that's the danger that we can fall into. It's certainly it's not exactly the same from the standpoint of, whether or not we believe Jesus is the Son of God. I mean, obviously the people that I'm talking to will believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And so you have that connection, but we can still fool ourselves into thinking that we are connected to them, connected to the Father and the Son, and quite frankly, have no relationship with them. Now, when I say fool yourselves, it literally will take that to occur. You would have to fool yourself because the fruit is going to be obvious. You're going to know if you're a child of God based on what he has written us. We know, First John will call it, we can have confidence, right, as his child. So it's not that maybe we are, maybe we're not. You can have a relationship with him. You can know that you have a relationship with him, and you can be confident in that relationship with him. The difficulty sometimes is we allow doubt to seep in, and we kind of allow other things to cloud our minds instead of just reading what he says and doing what he says and having this relationship that we can have with him. And that's really leading up to what's going to happen, because I'm going to tell you, if you didn't have a relationship with God, some of the things that he's about to warn them with, you would never want to go through. I mean, you think about chapter 16, just verse 2 as an example. They will make you outcast from the synagogue, but an hour is coming for everyone who kills you to think that he is offering service to God. Think about that verse. They're, again, walking to his death, there's going to come a point in time, and was already happening, where Jewish people were being kicked out of the synagogue because they were going to start following Jesus. They were being his disciples. And that meant a ton to them at the time. This was not just, hey, let's go to worship service. That was their community. I mean, they were all together. So they were kicked out of the synagogue was a huge thing. And then you take it to the next step, and I think about Paul, the apostle, where before he becomes the apostle, is killing people because he thinks he's serving God, the Father. And it's Jesus that says, Paul, why are you persecuting me? Why are you going against me? You can't hate me and love the Father. There's no way that you can do that. And that's the danger that we can fall into so quickly. There's a lot of people that are connected to a vine, but to the point you made, Tyler, early on, we're talking about the true vine. Are we part of the true vine? God knows his. And that is extremely important for us. We've talked about in the past the sheep. The sheep know his voice. The shepherd knows his sheep. And it's the same thing here. We can be a part of a branch, or we can be a branch to a vine, but we have to make sure it's the true vine that we are connected to. Because I assure you, the true vine knows which ones are the true branches. He absolutely knows. And so we've got to make sure that we have that kind of relationship with him. Are we doing what we need to do to prove to be my disciple? And again, that's not a word that I'm just trying to throw out there. I want you to, as far as you underline words, at least for me, abiding, prune, fruit, and prove are the words that I have underlined in this part. And there's a reason for that. I think proving is important. There's a lot of people that'll say it. It's not about saying it. It's about actually living it and proving it, which is what happens when you're his disciple. You have any thoughts, Tyler?
I think that's a good culmination of all the things he's talked about here. This is looking like Jesus because we're connected to him.
Yeah. And so, hopefully it's just something you continue to read in chapter 14. We kind of focus obviously on the direct context that's going on here, but this is a continuation of what's happening. You think over the last couple of weeks, we've looked at, John 14, John 15, a lot of obviously the chapters that are leading up to his death, and they all really kind of flow together. Jesus is giving us a life abundantly in chapter 10. Well, the reason he can do that is because we are connected to the source. We are the true, or we are the branch connected to the true vine. If we're not, what does he tell us here? We'll be cast off. We'll dry up, and we'll be burnt. In essence, is what he's talking about here. And so there's a connection that you see of all of them, but it's not about us. It's about him being the I am, the great I am, Jehovah, the eternal one, the source of all these things. And as we get into Revelation, it's going to be the same. I think Tyler said it very well. That can kind of scare us because you're going into a book that obviously can be and is difficult in some parts. But when we get into the parts that we're going to be looking at, especially just read chapter 1 if you're going to study with us next week, and just see the I ams that he's talking about there. And we can certainly see what he's talking about and how they apply. But it's a continuation of what we're talking about here, which is just a powerful statement. So next week, you'll see that verses 8, 17, and 18 really are the three that talk about the I ams, and they're very similar, which we'll obviously see as well. But the idea for us to understand is, why are they there? What's the purpose of them? How can we learn from them? What did they mean to the revelation itself? What did they mean to John? To John who's writing it? And then obviously from our perspective, what does it mean as we try to make application today? He's still the Alpha and the Omega. He's still the beginning and the end. And he still is the true vine. He still are all the things that we've talked about. So definitely appreciate you joining us. I know many will watch this after, and we certainly appreciate that as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them. We obviously can get back to you either on Facebook, or obviously next week when we get back online, we can answer those questions as well. But certainly appreciate the opportunity to spend a few minutes with you to study God's word. Zach, as always, appreciate you watching the Facebook comments that are coming in, and obviously studying with both of you is always a treat. But as far as this week, we're finished, I guess, for this time. But as Tyler said, go and get the sheet for next week, as was just shown off of our Facebook page.
Yeah, so just really quickly, I showed that, and then I didn't mention how to find it. So if you're in the West Mason family Facebook group, that's posted under our unit under the I Ams of Jesus. So that's a new PDF that you can go and download from the Facebook group. If you're not part of that Facebook group for whatever reason, maybe you're not a member at West Mason, but you'd still like to join in on these studies, reach out to us, send us a direct message here on our Facebook page, contact us through our website, however you're most comfortable reaching out to us, ask us for that, and we're happy to send you that PDF, again, that we can use over those next few weeks as we study the I Ams of Revelation.
All right. Well, again, if there's anything that we can do for you, just let us know. We certainly love you all and praying for you always, and ask you to do the same for us. And hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Talk to you all later.
Thank you guys. See y'all.